trembling as she clutched her boarding pass. The plastic felt cold against her sweaty palms. 3 years had passed since she lost her job as an airline safety inspector. It felt like yesterday when she had walked into her boss's office, full of hope and determination. She had discovered that the airline was cutting corners on safety checks to save money. Parts were not being replaced on time. Maintenance reports were being ignored. Emma knew that people's lives were at risk. She had to speak up. She had to do the right thing. But when she told her supervisors about the problems, they didn't thank her. They didn't fix the issues instead. They called her a troublemaker. They said she was causing problems for the company. Within a month, she was fired for not being a team player. Emma looked round the busy airport terminal. Families were rushing to catch their flights. Children were laughing and playing. Business people were typing on their phones. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to go. Everyone except her. The airport buzzed with frustrated passengers dealing with the new 2025 flight restrictions. Emma watched the security guards confiscated smartwatches from confused travelers. She saw them limiting how many portable chargers people could bring. The rules seemed to change every day. Near the security checkpoint, a young mother named Katie burst into tears. Her little boy, who looked about 5 years old, was crying loudly. A security guard was holding his small blue blanket. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the guard said firmly. "New fabric regulations. This blanket has metal threads in it. It's not allowed. On the plane. It's not fair." Katie sobbed, pulling her son close. "He can't sleep without it. He's had that blanket since he was born. Please, can't you make an exception?" The guard shook his head. "Rules are rules. I don't make them, I just follow them." Emma's heart ached as she watched the scene. She knew these rules were meant to keep people safe. After all, she had spent years working in airline safety, but she could see how they hurt innocent families. Sometimes rules made sense on paper but caused real pain in real life. She thought about her own father, who had passed away just last week. The funeral was tomorrow in London. She hadn't spoken to him in 2 years, not since she lost her job. He had been so ashamed of her failure. He couldn't understand why she had to speak up about the safety problems. "Why couldn't you just keep quiet?" he had asked her during their last phone call. "You had a good job. You threw it all away for what? To prove a point." Emma had tried to explain that it wasn't about proving a point. It was about saving lives. But her father couldn't see it that way. He had grown up in a time when you kept your head down and did what you were told. Speaking up was dangerous. It could cost you everything, and it had cost her everything. Her job, her reputation, her relationship with her father. And now he was gone, and she would never have the chance to make things right between them as she boarded the plane. Emma felt the weight of her broken dreams pressing down on her shoulders. The flight attendant smiled at her as she found her seat, but she could barely manage to smile back. Once, she had been proud to keep passengers safe. She had loved her job. She had felt important. Like she was making a difference in the world. Now, she was just another traveler, scared and alone. She looked out the small airplane window at the ground crew loading luggage. She used to know all their procedures by heart. She used to check that everything was done correctly. Now, she had to trust that someone else was doing the job she used to do. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The plane was filling up with passengers. She could hear families talking excitedly about their vacations. She could hear business people making phone calls. She could hear the sounds of normal life continuing around her. But she didn't feel normal. She felt broken. She felt like she had lost everything that mattered to her. Her career, her father's respect, her sense of purpose. She wondered if she would ever feel whole again. The plane's engine started to rumble. Soon they would be in the air, flying toward London and her father's funeral. Flying toward a future that felt uncertain and frightening. Sometimes we feel most broken when we're about to discover our true strength. 20 minutes into the flight, Emma felt the plane begin to shake. At first, it was just a gentle rocking motion, like being on a boat in calm water. But then the shaking became stronger and more violent. The airplane felt like it was being tossed round by invisible giant hands. Emma gripped her armrest tightly. Her knuckles turned white as she held on. The lights above her head flickered on and off. The overhead compartments rattled loudly. She could hear passengers gasping and murmuring with worry. But Emma's trained ear caught something else. She could hear the flight crew talking in hushed, urgent voices. Their tone was different from the calm, professional voices she was used to hearing. There was confusion in their whispers. There was worry. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. The sound was fuzzy and broken, not clear like it should be. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your seats with your seat belts fastened." The captain's voice tried to sound normal, but Emma could hear the tension underneath his words. She had spent years working with pilots and flight crews. She knew how they talked when everything was fine. This was not how they talked when everything was fine. Emma looked round the cabin. Other passengers were looking worried too. But they didn't understand what was really happening. They thought this was just bad weather, just ordinary turbulence that would pass soon. But Emma knew better. Years of experience told her something was seriously wrong with the airplane. She watched the flight attendants moving through the cabin. They were trying to look calm, but Emma could see the worry in their eyes. She noticed how they whispered to each other when they thought passengers weren't looking. She saw how their faces were pale and tight with stress. One flight attendant, a young woman with blonde hair, was checking the emergency equipment. Emma saw her hands shaking as she counted the oxygen masks. Another flight attendant was talking quietly into a phone, probably speaking to the pilot. His voice was too low for passengers to hear, but Emma could see the serious expression on his face. Across the aisle from Emma, an elderly man named George was having trouble breathing. He clutched his chest with both hands, taking short, quick breaths. His face was red and sweaty. Emma remembered seeing him at the airport security checkpoint earlier. George had been carrying a small oxygen concentrator, a machine that helped him breathe better. But the security guards had taken it away because of new battery restrictions. They said the battery was too big and might be dangerous. George had begged them to let him keep it, explaining that he needed it for his health. But they had refused. Now, with the plane shaking and the cabin pressure changing, George was struggling. His breathing was getting worse. Emma could see that he was scared and in pain. She wanted to help him, but she didn't know what to do. Near the back of the plane, Kitty's son was crying loudly. The little boy was still upset about his comfort. Blanket being taken away at security. The turbulence was making him even more frightened. His mother was trying to calm him down, but nothing was working. Other passengers were starting to look annoyed by the noise. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. It felt like the airplane had hit something big and solid in the sky. Several passengers screamed. A woman behind Emma started crying. A man in the front row was praying out loud. Emma closed her eyes and tried to stay calm, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. The same disappointed words he had said 30 years ago. "You threw away everything for what? To prove a point." Maybe he was right. Maybe she should have stayed quiet when she discovered the safety problems at her old job. Maybe she should have kept her head down and minded her own business. If she had done that, she would still have her job. she would still have her father's respect. She would still have a purpose in life. Maybe speaking up had been a mistake. Maybe trying to do the right thing had only caused her pain and loss. Maybe she was just a foolish woman who thought she could change the world, but only succeeded in destroying her own life. But as she opened her eyes and looked round the cabin, Emma saw something that made her heart race. She saw real fear in people's faces. She saw George struggling to breathe. She saw Katie's son crying in terror. She saw passengers who needed help, who needed someone to guide them through this scary situation. Something stirred deep inside her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in 3 years. It was the feeling of being needed. In our darkest moments, we often find the courage we thought we'd lost. Emma couldn't sit still any longer. The plane was still shaking, and she could see that people around her were getting more and more scared. She had been sitting in her seat for the past few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to stay quiet and invisible, just like she had been for the past 3 years. But another part of her, a part that had been sleeping for a long time, the plane was still moving roughly, so she had to hold onto the seats as she walked. She made her way toward the front of the cabin, where she had seen one of the flight attendants looking very worried. The flight attendant was a young woman with brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag said Lucy. Emma could see that Lucy was trying her best to help passengers, but she looked overwhelmed and scared. Her hands were shaking as she tried to check on people. "Excuse me," Emma said quietly, touching Lucy's arm gently. "I'm a former airline safety inspector. Can I help you with anything?" Lucy turned to look at Emma, and her eyes immediately filled with relief. It was like seeing a lifeguard when you're drowning in deep water. "Oh, thank goodness," Lucy whispered. "The captain says we might need to make an emergency landing. The passengers are panicking, and we don't have enough flight attendants to calm everyone down." "I don't know what to do." Emma nodded and looked round the cabin. She could see the fear on people's faces. Some passengers were crying. Others were holding onto their armrests so tightly that their knuckles were white. A few people were trying to use their phones, even though they wouldn't work at this altitude. "I can help," Emma said, her voice becoming stronger and more confident. "Let me work with the passengers while you focus on the emergency procedures." Lucy nodded gratefully and hurried toward the front of the plane to talk to the other flight attendants. Emma took a deep breath and began moving through the cabin with gentle confidence. It felt strange but familiar, like putting on an old coat that still fit perfectly. She went to George first, the elderly man who was having trouble breathing. He was still clutching his chest, and his face was getting redder. Emma knelt down beside his seat and spoke to him in a calm, soothing voice. "Hello, George," she said. "I'm Emma. I used to work for the airline, and I want to help you feel better. Can you look at me and try to breathe with me?" George looked at her with frightened eyes, but he nodded. Emma began showing him slow, deep breathing exercises. She had learned these techniques during her safety training years ago. "In through your nose, slowly," she said, demonstrating. "Hold it for 3 seconds. Now out through your mouth. Nice and slow." At first, George's breathing was still quick and panicked, but as Emma continued to guide him, his breathing began to slow down. The red color in his face started to fade. "That's perfect," Emma said encouragingly. "You're doing great. Just keep breathing with me." After helping George, Emma made her way to the back of the plane where Katie's son was still crying. The little boy was about 5 years old, with curly brown hair and tears streaming down his cheeks. His mother, Katie, was holding him tightly, but nothing she said seemed to help. Emma sat down in the empty seat next to them. "Hi there," she said to the little boy in a gentle voice. "What's your name?" The boy looked at her through his tears, but didn't answer. Katy looked at Emma with tired, worried eyes. "His name is Tommy," she said. "He's scared because they took his blanket at the airport." And now, with all this shaking, Emma smiled warmly at Tommy. "You know what, Tommy? I know a really fun counting game that might help you feel better. Do you want to try it with me?" Tommy wiped his nose with the back of his hand and nodded slightly. Emma began teaching him a simple counting game, where they counted things they could see in the airplane. "Let's count the windows," she said. 1, 2, 3. Soon, Tommy was counting along with her, and his crying began to stop as Emma moved through the cabin. She spoke to each passenger who looked scared or worried. "You're going to be okay," she told them, her voice steady and reassuring. "I know it's scary, but we're going to get through this together. The pilots know what they're doing, and we have good people taking care of us." Something amazing was happening. Emma felt useful again. She felt like she had a purpose. For the first time in 3 years, she was using her skills and knowledge to help people. It felt wonderful. As she worked, Emma felt something crinkle in her jacket pocket. She reached in and pulled out an envelope. It was a letter with her name written on it in her father's handwriting. She had forgotten that the funeral director had given it to her yesterday, saying her father had asked for it to be delivered to her. With shaking hands, Emma opened the letter. Her father's familiar handwriting filled the page. "My dear Emma, I was wrong to be ashamed of you. You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you everything. I'm proud of you. Love. Dad." Tears streamed down Emma's face, but for the first time in years. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of healing. Sometimes the love we need most comes just when we're ready to receive it. The plane touched down at Birmingham Airport with a gentle bump. Emma felt her body relax as the wheels hit the runway. The terrible shaking had stopped about 20 minutes ago, and the captain had announced that they were making an emergency landing just to be safe. Everyone was okay, but it had been the most frightening flight of her life. As the plane rolled to a stop, Emma looked round the cabin. The passengers who had been crying and panicking earlier were now calm. George was breathing normally, his face no longer red and sweaty. Tommy was sitting quietly in his mother's lap, no longer crying. The whole atmosphere in the plane had changed from fear to relief. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at Birmingham Airport. We apologize for the frightening experience. Please remain seated while we arrange for buses to take you to the terminal." As passengers began to gather their belongings, something unexpected started happening. People began coming up to Emma to thank her. It started with George, who slowly made his way over to her seat. "Thank you so much," he said, his voice still a little shaky, but much stronger than before. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me with my breathing. You have a real gift." "Young lady, don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. "I'm just glad you're feeling better," she said. Then Katy came over, carrying Tommy in her arms. The little boy was sleepy now, tired from all the crying and excitement. Katy squeezed Emma's hand tightly. "You saved my son's sanity today," Katy said, her voice full of emotion. "When he was crying and scared, you were the only one who could calm him down. You're a hero." Emma shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what felt right." But Katy wasn't the only one who felt that way. As they waited for the buses, more and more passengers came up to Emma. An elderly woman thanked her for helping her stay calm. A businessman said she had prevented him from having a panic attack. A teenager said Emma's calm voice had helped her feel safe. One passenger, a man named David, had been recording video on his phone during the flight. He had captured Emma moving through the cabin, helping people and speaking to them in her gentle, reassuring voice. "Would it be okay if I shared this online?" he asked. "I think people need to see how one person's kindness can make such a difference." Emma wasn't sure about being on social media, but she nodded. She thought it might help people understand what had happened during the flight. Within hours of landing, David's video had spread across social media. People were sharing it everywhere. On Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, the video showed Emma helping George with his breathing exercises, comforting Tommy, and speaking calmly to frightened passengers. But the video was about more than just Emma's kindness. Passengers began sharing their own stories in the comments. They talked about how the new 2025 flight restrictions had made travel difficult for people with special needs. George wrote about how his oxygen concentrator had been taken away. Kitty shared how her son's comfort blanket had been confiscated. Other people told similar stories about medical devices, comfort items, and support animals being taken away at security. People were saying that while safety was important, the new rules were too strict. They were hurting innocent people who just wanted to travel safely with the things they needed. Emma's story became a symbol of how compassion could work together with safety rules. The next morning, Emma was having breakfast in her hotel room when her phone rang. The number looked official, and she almost didn't answer it. But something told her to pick up. Double quotes, "Hello, is this Emma Thompson?" said a professional-sounding woman's voice. "Yes, this is Emma." She replied cautiously, "Miss Thompson, this is Sarah Williams from the Civil Aviation Authority. We've seen the video of your actions during yesterday's flight, and we've been reading about your background as a former airline safety inspector. We'd like to speak with you about helping us review our current regulations." Emma's heart started beating faster. The Civil Aviation Authority was the government agency that made the rules for airlines and airports. They were the ones who had created the new restrictions that had caused so many problems. "We need someone who understands both safety and human compassion," Sarah continued. "Someone who can help us find the right balance between keeping people safe and treating them with dignity. Would you be interested in consulting with us?" And forgotten. Someone wanted her expertise again. But more importantly, she realized that she wanted to help. She thought of Katie's son crying without his blanket. She thought of George struggling to breathe without his oxygen machine. She thought of all the passengers who needed someone to speak up for them. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear for the first time in years. "I'd be honored to help." Our greatest failures often prepare us for our most meaningful successes. 6 months later, Emma stood in a large conference room on the 20th floor of a government building in London. The room was filled with important people, airline executives, in expensive suits, government officials with serious faces, and airport security managers with years of experience. All of them were looking at her, waiting to hear what she had to say. Emma looked down at the thick folder in her hands. Inside were dozens of pages of new guidelines that she had spent weeks writing. These weren't just rules written on paper. They were ideas that came from her heart, from remembering the faces of scared passengers, from thinking about George's breathing problems and Tommy's tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, her voice clear and confident, "I'd like to present the new travel guidelines that we've developed together. These rules will help us keep people safe while also treating them with kindness and respect." She opened her folder and began to explain her ideas. The new guidelines allowed people to bring necessary medical devices on planes if they had proper documentation from their doctors. They created quiet spaces in airports where anxious travelers could calm down before their flights. They trained airport staff to recognize when rules needed to be flexible to help people with special needs. "We're calling them the Emma Thompson protocols," said Mr. Johnson, the head of the Civil Aviation Authority. Emma felt her cheeks turn red. She had never expected to have rules named after her. The airline executives asked many questions, but they seemed impressed with Emma's work. They could see that her ideas would make flying better for everyone, while still keeping people safe. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to start using the new guidelines in airports across the country. As Emma walked out of the building, she felt proud and happy. But she also felt something else, a sense of peace for the first time. In 3 years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 1 year later, on the anniversary of that frightening flight, Emma found herself back at Manchester Airport. But this time, everything was different. She wasn't a scared, broken woman traveling to her father's funeral. She was a confident consultant, traveling to Birmingham to give a presentation about airport safety. As she walked through the terminal, Emma watched families moving through security. She saw an elderly man with an oxygen concentrator being helped by friendly airport staff. She watched a mother with a crying baby being directed to a quiet family area where she could calm her child down. She noticed how the security guards spoke to passengers with patience and respect. Everything was different now. The airport felt more welcoming, more human. People were still being kept safe, but they were also being treated with dignity and kindness. At the departure gate, Emma heard someone calling her name. She turned round and saw a familiar face. It was Katie, the young mother from the flight a year ago. She was traveling with her son Tommy, who was now 6 years old and much taller than Emma remembered. "Emma," Katie said, running over to give her a hug. "I can't believe it's you. Look, Tommy. It's the nice lady from the airplane." Tommy smiled shyly and waved. He was holding a small travel bag decorated with cartoon airplanes. "Look," Kitty said, excitedly, unzipping the bag to show Emma what was inside. "He has his comfort blanket and all his favorite things. The new rules you helped create made this possible. He's not scared to fly anymore." Emma knelt down to Tommy's level. "That's wonderful. Tommy, I'm so glad you have your blanket back. You excited about your trip?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "We're going to see my grandma in Spain, and I'm not scared because I have my blanket and my toy airplane." As Emma watched Katie and Tommy board their plane, she thought about her father's letter. He had written that he was proud of her for standing up for what was right, even when it cost her everything. At the time, losing her job had felt like the end of the world. But now she could see that it had been just the beginning. She had found her purpose again, not despite her failure, but because of it. Sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. Her father had been right. She had stood up for what was right, and even though it had been painful, it had led her to something better. As her plane took off, Emma looked out. The small window at the world below. The cities and fields looked tiny from up in the sky. She was no longer the broken woman who had lost her job for speaking up. She was someone who had learned that true strength comes from helping others, that every ending is really just a new beginning. Emma closed her eyes and smiled. She was finally flying again. Not just in an airplane, but in life. She had learned that when we choose compassion over comfort, we don't just change our own lives, we change the world. When we choose compassion over comfort, we don't just change our own lives, we change the world.